All right, welcome to NNP Symposium. This is our 2 p.m. session with John Kraljevich, speaking on collecting American historical metals, how to define and build a meaningful cabinet. John is well known in the numismatic industry, longtime cataloger with Stax Bowers, and also runs his own business, JK Americana, specializing in American historical metals. All right, with John, I'll turn over to you.
All right, good deal. Everybody can hear me all right, I hope. Good morning or good afternoon, good Saturday to you. The title today is Collecting American Historical Metals, How to Define and Build a Meaningful Cabinet. So the idea of today's presentation is basically to give some ideas to folks that maybe haven't pursued American historical metals already or have just dipped their toe in. It's such a vast field that it intimidates a lot of people. So the idea of today's presentation is to make it a little less intimidating and to give you some concepts and some tools on how to go forward collecting and how to make what you have into something more than just a pile of metals and actually make it into something cohesive and meaningful. So first, I guess, let's define some terms here. What is an American historical metal? Well, at the risk of being tautological here, it's American, it's historic, and it's a metal. That's pretty much it. Now, in terms of real definitions here, that tends to exclude military decorations. I see my slide got a little messed up here, and art metals is what that should say. So military decorations, hanging badges tend not to be considered American historical metals. Metals made strictly for artistic purposes tend not to be American historical metals. And also modern pieces. So pieces that self-consciously commemorate past events tend not to be historical metals, but pretty much everything else is an American historical metal. When I started in this field, it's now been 20 years, the concept of an American historical metal generally stopped at 1900 for some reasons we'll get into, but there's certainly plenty of stuff after 1900 that fits into the fabric and texture and sort of general idea of an American historical metal. So that arbitrary boundary is probably nothing you have to stick to anymore. Okay, so metal collectors like to go by their books, and this is the way that a lot of people end up collecting their metals. The Betts book, American Colonial History as Illustrated by Contemporary Metals, and contemporary in that meaning means contemporary to colonial times, not contemporary to modern times. R.W. Julian's book, Metals of the United States Mint, the First Century, that ends in 1900, and that's one of the reasons that historical metals have generally been defined as 1900 or before. So that a lot of that has to do with Julian. Baker's Medallic Portraits of Washington, the DeWitt book on campaign medalettes, Father Pruka's book on American Indian peace metals, Greenslet's book on Franklin portraiture kind of goes along with the Baker book, and King and Paul Cunningham's more recent book on Lincoln portraiture. So you can collect portraits of famous Americans, and then Eaglet covers portraits of Christopher Columbus and things particularly connected to the Columbian Exposition of 1892. So when you go by the book, there are certain advantages. It defines a series. It sets boundaries on the series. It's in the book or it's not in the book. You have a natural numbering system. We collectors like to put things in order. It's what we do. So it's nice to be able to identify something as Baker 20 or a Greenslet number or Julian AM 30 or what have you. And for a lot of collectors who look at the metal series as sort of widespread and infinite in what it could possibly encompass, these books project order onto that chaos. So they serve as checklists, they serve as security blankets. And for the best of these books, like say the Neil Musante book on Washington metals, they really also function as historical guides with great information about what the metals are and who made them, and kind of puts them in the context, not just of where they fit in a particular medallic series, but also where they fit in the broader theme of that particular field of American history. Now, collecting by the book also has cons. If you say you collect Betts metals, well, bad news for you, you're never going to complete a collection of Betts metals. There are 623 metals listed in that book. Some of them literally don't exist. They were pulled out of descriptions of other books, or metals that were authorized but never produced. So if you're a person who likes to complete a set, maybe buy the book Metal Collecting isn't for you. Every set includes metals of really great interest and really important things, and then metals that maybe aren't so interesting. So, if you say you're going to collect all the Julian metals, that's great. You end up with historic, exciting metals related to the Revolution and the War of 1812. But you might end up with some stuff that you really don't care about. And if you're collecting by the book and trying to complete a series, that's a downside. The expansiveness of a by the book metal collecting series pushes the boundaries of resources and understanding. In other words, if you're going to collect all the books listed in, or all the metals listed in Baker's Medallic Portraits of Washington, unless you're really, really rich, it's hard to collect all of it. Or it's hard to get all of those metals in the amount of time that we can devote to our hobby. And you're also going to end up with some metals that maybe just are beyond your understanding. In other words, a metal that depicts Washington, that is struck for commemorate his death, the funeral medal. That's pretty easy to understand. But then you have other stuff that's obscure and weird, and no one likes to collect stuff they don't understand, or stuff that doesn't actually trip their trigger. So that's another issue with collecting metals by the book. To my mind, the biggest con of collecting metals strictly by the book, you end up missing out on a ton of great metals. I could write a whole book listing off American historical metals that aren't in another book. Like, for instance, the medal that's illustrated there, that's the Davis Guards Medal, which was really the first Confederate medal ever produced, and the only Confederate medal produced to honor soldiers in a particular battle. And that was a battle that took place on the Texas frontier. It's not in any book. I think it's in Belden's book, United States War Medals, but that's not a book that a lot of people collect by. So when you end up collecting by the book, you end up confining your collection. In other words, you're not going to collect things that aren't in that book, even if they perhaps should be. And it ends up being kind of a crutch. Instead of being able to be creative and develop your own cabinet by your own meanings, you end up leaning on the book to decide if I should buy it or if I shouldn't buy it. Okay, so there's lots of other ways to collect American historical metals, and that's what we'll talk about over the next 45 minutes or so. You can collect them by subdivisions of those book series, by themes, by geography, by graphics, by perhaps who produced them, the artist or the engraver, and then also sort of by time period. So let's go through each of those in order. When we talk about subdivisions, the entire Julian book, covering all the metals produced at the United States Mint between 1792 and 1900, it's vast, and you end up with medals devoted to societies, or honoring particular people, or particular battles, or historical fairs, agricultural organizations, all sorts of stuff. Maybe that's not all your thing. So maybe you focus in on one particular subdivision of Julian medals, like Julian's NA series, which is a series of medals that were just devoted to American naval heroes and victories. What's depicted there is the reverse of a Silver War of 1812 medal. Lots of people like to collect naval medals. That's a popular subdivision. If you're collecting Washington medals, maybe all of the die sinker material struck at the late 19th century, in the 1860s and 70s, that were made just for numismatists, just for collectors, maybe that's not your thing. So maybe you define your collection of Washington medals from the very earliest medals, like the Voltaire medal, which was the first medal to depict Washington about 1778, and then set some relatively early cutoff. Maybe you'll collect through 1820 or 1825, whatever you decide. That medal depicted there is the famous and legendary rarity, the Emancipator of America medal. And maybe you want to collect campaign medals, but collecting medals of Benjamin Harrison doesn't do anything for you. So maybe you focus just on the Abraham Lincoln series. There are dozens of medals. You can collect them in a wide variety of compositions and qualities. So maybe you devote yourself just to collecting that particular subdivision. Themes. Endless themes you can collect with medals. A lot of people like to collect medical medals, or medals depicting ships, things of a nautical nature, medals with interesting historical portraiture, like this very rare medal, generally only available as a later electrotype, depicting Anne Arundel, who was a wife of Cecil Calvert, the founder of Maryland. You can pick any theme you want. You can collect medals of American furniture makers. You can pick medals that depict Model Ts, anything. And that sort of dovetails into some of these other ways to do it. These are all generally themes, but they're more specific themes. Medals of South Carolina, something I collect. It's a fairly confined series. There's not thousands of medals related to South Carolina, but there's enough to make it interesting. Medals of historic Virginians, like the SS Central America Medal that honored Captain Herndon, the namesake of Herndon, Virginia. This is where research comes in. You might not discover that a certain medal has something to do with a particular historic Virginian or a particular state or your city or something. So that's a lot of fun in the process of discovery. Graphics. This relies less on what the medals were struck to commemorate and more on what the medals actually depict. I had a collector once who collected any kind of bird on a medal that wasn't an eagle. With eagles, it's endless. There's just too many eagles. But once you start getting into medals that depict, pelicans, it makes the thrill of the hunt a little more fun. Medals with planes. Obviously, this is, you're not going to collect medals with planes if you're cutting off American historical medals at 1900. But if you like 20th century medals, and if you like things like Art Deco art, maybe medals with planes is a really interesting specialty. Medals with maps. This is endless. There's all sorts of neat things with maps and globes on it. So this is another popular graphic thematic subspecialty. The medal depicted there, by the way, is the famous 1758 Louisburg medal, which exists in gold and silver and copper, that was struck to be given to those who took place in the Battle of Louisburg in 1758 at the tip of Nova Scotia. I have a dog at my elbow, so if I'm looking weird, it's because I'm getting licked at the moment, so I apologize. Artists and engravers. This is very popular. Some people like the work of C.C. Wright, or Anthony C. Paquette, or Charles Barber, or Charles Morgan, or George Morgan, I'm sorry. There are so many talented or less talented medallic engravers, and it's interesting to build a body of their work the same way you might collect, the work of Mark Rothko or Gilbert Stuart. And the nice thing about collecting by engraver is that not only do you get to focus on how their art changed over time, but you also get to enjoy a broad series of medals because, say, Charles Barber did Indian Peace medals, Charles Barber did society medals, award medals, military medal, all sorts of things. So each of those can be interesting and rewarding specialties. And then time period. This is perhaps the most popular way to do it. Collect medals that are illustrative of 18th century America, or collect medals relating to the U.S. Civil War, this sort of thing. So you've got a 1787 Columbian-Washington medal. That's a medal that is only listed in one book that I know of, which is Storer's Medal on the Numismatics of Massachusetts, which wasn't actually a book. It was a monograph published in a series. You've got the Charleston Social Club Medal, classic 18th century scene. Civil War medals, things like an Abraham Lincoln Civil War dog tag, or the Paquette Medal for the Sanitary Fair in Philadelphia. Any period of time you like, whether it be Reconstruction or the presidency of Andrew Jackson. Take your pick, slice and dice as you like. Other ways to do it. Some people like to collect the top 100 American medals and tokens as defined by the book by Katie Jaeger and Dave Bowers. Those medals were chosen by vote of various nerds and specialists like me. And in the back, there's another several hundred medals that were receiving votes. So if you collect that series, you end up with all of the medals that are sort of most famous, most widely desired, or considered most interesting by people who, say, do this for a living or who have been collecting for a long time. Now, if you do go that route, a lot of those medals are very rare and very expensive, and some of them you'll just never get. Something that's become more popular since certification has become a dominant force in the hobby is this box of 20 approach. And that basically says that there's 20 slots in a PCGS box, and you're going to get the 20 medals that you like the most. When you get 21 medals, time to sell the one you like the least. Now, some people have a theoretical box of 20. Some people have a literal box of 20, like an actual PCGS box, which obviously confines things by size and shape. A box of 20 approaches is interesting to me because it means that the medals that you get are things you like. You're not forced to buy medals just because they fit into your parameters. You can buy medals that you enjoy for whatever reason. That being said, only getting 20 medals, it's like only eating one meal a day. That's like only getting 2 days of sunshine a week. It's how do you do it? Not my favorite approach in the world, but it works for a lot of people, especially people that collect other sorts of coins or tokens or have other interests. Buffet style. Collect what you want. Collect literally anything you want. You see a medal, it looks neat, buy it. It could be an agricultural medal. It could be a historical medal. It could be a peace medal. It could be a Civil War medal. It could be a medal not listed in any book. It could be a medal listed in 10 books. Maybe you like seeing Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis hanging from a gallows next to each other. Maybe that amuses you. Buy them both. Maybe you like medals that depict bears. Maybe you like medals that depict any kind of animal. Do what you want. It's your life. It's your money. Go nuts. Now, you look at these medals and they look attractive all laid out like this. You've got gilt medals, you've got brass, you've got copper, silver, white metal, tin. I don't think there's anybody watching this that wouldn't find it attractive or interesting to own this group of medals and lay them out on a tray and just enjoy them. And there's nothing in the world wrong with that. I see a question and answer thing popping up here. I'm going to, not able to see it right now, so we'll get to that at the end. And if that's what trips your trigger, if that's what makes you enjoy medals, go crazy. Here's what I would recommend for someone who's a new medal collector. Start out this way. Don't start out saying, I've never collected medals before. I'm going to collect medals of the War of 1812. When you're just starting out, you just might not know enough to define a set of parameters and not end up getting into frustration either by being forced to skip medals that are too expensive or have medals on your list that are just too rare that are unlikely to be found. So start this way. There is no way better to figure out what you like or figure out what kind of research makes your heart go pitter-patter than to buy some medals that you find interesting for one reason or another that you just don't know much about. Owning something puts the onus on you to force yourself to discover everything you can about it. It forces you to spend the time and the investment of time to match your monetary investment. If you bought, say, the medal depicting the train up there, because you like trains, wouldn't you go and try to find everything you could about the American Society of Railway Engineers or what circumstances the silver medals versus the gold medals were given out? Wouldn't you try to go read an article about the 1829 rocket depicted there? And maybe that sends you towards another specialty. All medals depicting trains, all medals struck to honor railway engineers, all medals illustrative of American transportation technology, what have you. But the point is that it's one thing to academically read about a medal and then decide to go buy it. It's another thing to have a medal in your hand and say, all right, I have this object. Now it's on me to figure out everything I can about it and then kind of link the things you like about it most to what you might like about other medals. So honestly, no matter what numismatic area you're collecting, I always recommend that people buy something that they like, but they don't know much about, and then try to find everything you can. And if you own something and you read about it and it doesn't trip your trigger, go buy something else. Again, it's your collection. All right, let's see here. All right, so cross-disciplinary or historical approaches. This is the primary way that I collect. At heart, I'm a historian. At heart, I collect medals or other numismatic objects as things that both remind us of history and serve as illustrations of history in that moment. I think that collecting this way helps these things become more than objects, but actually helps them become talismans towards stories and narratives and histories that maybe you might not discover otherwise. So, you look at something like the medal depicted there at the lower left, which was issued by the governor of Colorado, facing many of the heavy-handed crackdowns on mining laborers and striking mine workers. And it actually depicts a miner and a law enforcement officer who was sent out to basically put down the strike. That's fascinating. And if you're interested in the history of American labor, that might well send you down the tracks of not just learning about that particular part of the labor movement, but give you an entree into other numismatic items that are illustrative of the history of labor. I collect African American history as depicted on American historical medals. It's an endless field of very rare items, and that thrill of discovery not only is fun as a collector, but it's also a lot of fun trying to track down new things and then learn everything that you can about them. Political history, there's obviously inaugural medals and campaign medals and medals struck to memorialize dead presidents and this and that. It's endless. And again, American technology is very interesting, especially for people who tend to work in that field. And a lot of those medals are both rare and unusual to encounter in the numismatic marketplace, because a lot of those sort of trade elsewhere. So you can tell a better story collecting like a historian or collecting like a curator, as opposed to collecting like someone filling in an album of Lincoln cents, if that all makes sense. All right, so popular collecting specialties that have no major reference work. And some of you out there, I can't see exactly who's watching this presentation, but some of you out there should be writing books about this stuff right now. Academic medals, enormous field, goes back to the 18th century, extends to the present day. You've got high schools and colleges and technical schools and endless, literally endless. There's no good book on it. While medals related to various American conflicts are covered by other books, there are no devoted books to medals of the War of 1812, medals of the Mexican-American War, medals of the Civil War. It's stunning that there's not a book on Civil War medals. I've started outlining a book on medals of the Mexican-American War, so hopefully that will end up being a finished product someday. Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, take your pick. How is there not a book on these subjects? People collect this stuff. The book that would inevitably follow Julian, mint medals since 1900, great field. No one knows anything about them. There are a few hardy collectors who have done research on various parts of this. There are some people that devotedly collect this stuff. Bill Swoger wrote a book on national commemorative medals that covers many of the best medals struck since 1900, but there's no follow-up Julian for the next century. Be a great project for somebody. Medals of American expositions, the ones made at the U.S. Mint are covered in Julian. Many of the rest aren't. And there's some wonderful, rare, attractive medals that, again, don't have any book written about them. Agricultural and mechanical fairs are sort of related to expositions. The Harkness book is essentially a catalog of the Harkness collection, which is wonderful, and it's a great place to find these medals illustrated and have a meaningful numbering system. But ultimately, what the book tells you is that the medal that you're looking up exists. It doesn't give you a whole lot more than that. And of course, there are medals that aren't in that book as well. Medals of American numismatists, whether it be the medals that were created by Thomas Elder, which were cataloged by Tom Delury in a series of numismatist articles, or medals depicting American numismatists, like those produced by the New York Numismatic Club or Rochester Numismatic Society. Great, interesting field. It's something that people collect. There's no book on it. And learned societies. The National Institute of Oceanography produced a great medal that has an octopus on it. Stuff like that's not in any book either. But again, lots of fun to collect. Somebody could write that book and have an instant audience for it. All right. I don't mean to upset anyone, but I'm going to tell you how I feel. There is a wrong way to collect medals, and it is encapsulated in the so-called dollar book. Hibbler Kappan, HK, wrote this book in the 1950s, and tell me what those four medals depicted have in common. You've got the famous 1826 medal for the Erie Canal. You've got a dollar token issued by Joseph Lesher in the silver mining districts of Colorado around 1900. You have the 45th convention of the Marking Device Association held in October of 1959, and you have a pocket piece sold as a fundraiser for the Freedom's Foundation. I can't imagine anyone collecting all four of these things and enjoying all four of these equally, or seeing these as part of a cohesive collection. So tell me what these medals, I'm sorry that my text is getting cut off here. This showed up a little bit different in the PDF. What do these medals have in common? You've got a medal from the 1876 Centennial Exposition. You've got a really great medal from the Louisiana Purchase Exposition with these cool facing cartoonish busts of Thomas Jefferson and Teddy Roosevelt. You've got a medal that was issued for the creation of the General Lee Monument in Richmond at Monument Avenue, and a medal that commemorates the day that the Statue of Liberty was erected. What these medals have in common is that they honor occasions that are identical to or similar to or related to those included in the so-called dollar book. And they meet the other parameters of the so-called dollar book, but they're not in there. And like the medal down at the lower left, the Washington medal, it's not particularly rare. There's no reason to exclude it. The Robert E. Lee medal is not particularly rare. There's no reason to exclude it, especially since other medals honoring statuary are in there. It's just not in there. So if you go by the so-called dollar book, you end up with the 45th convention of the Marking Device Association in your collection, and you end up leaving out the Statue of Liberty and what I think is one of the coolest Louisiana Purchase Exposition medals. So the lesson of the HK book to me, when you're coming and defining your own medal collection, is if you pick a topic that's too broad, like all American medals 33 to 45 millimeters in diameter, except Bryan dollars that are bigger, except for hanging badges, military medals, presidential and political medals, academic, athletic, or armed forces medals, or any token, unless it's the Leschers, you end up missing a bunch of the good stuff, and the rest of it, it lacks incongruity. An Erie Canal medal and the 45th anniversary of the American Marking Device Association, if you collect HK medals, you end up needing them both if you want to complete the series or what have you. But I'm going to say that most people that want an Erie Canal medal probably don't care a lot about the Marking Device Association. And again, the size parameters there, 33 to 45 millimeters, is meant to be so-called dollars. Literally, the only so-called dollars in the book are the Leschers and the Bryan dollars. Bryan dollars are so-called dollars, and Lescher dollars are so-called dollars. But the parameters exclude the best of those, the Bryan dollars by size and the Lescher dollars by tokens. It just seems ill-conceived to me. Obviously, folks can collect what they want. Obviously, there are hundreds of awesome so-called dollars, and I love them. But the way this book is put together does not strike me as the best way to pursue a medal collecting hobby. It's kind of like collecting all 19 millimeter medals except for X, Y, and Z. Whatever trips your trigger. If you like 19 millimeters as a size, go nuts. I think there's a better way to do it. So the takeaway lesson of all of this, and I'm glad we finished in more or less a half an hour, so there's plenty of time to debate me on this or ask questions. Define your collection the way you want, but define the collection. Find a cohesive theme, or find a bunch of cohesive themes. Or tell me that I'm nuts and go buy whatever medals you want, even if they have nothing to do with each other. It's your collection, it's your money. There's no reason to let someone else tell you to collect medals in a particular way. There's no reason to be a slave to a book. There's no reason to feel confined by a certain series. If you collect a theme that's too broad, you end up with the dissatisfaction that comes from a series that you're never going to be able to complete. If you end up with a very narrow theme, only collect medals that are related to African-American history in Detroit between 1940 and 1950 that happen to be 42 millimeters, you're never going to buy anything. And what fun is that? The whole point of collecting is to acquire things, right? Now, if you come up with a creative theme, medals that depict graduates of the University of Virginia, you end up with a lot of fun research opportunities, trying to figure out who went to UVA, trying to figure out what medals there are out there, and you end up finding inexpensive but rare medals that you enjoy just as much as sort of famous medals that are expensive because of their fame. And the point is for you to enjoy them, not for someone else to enjoy them. Some of the medals that I love the most cost me less than $10 because they fit into this creative theme and is something unexpected and something that was made into a neat research jumping off possibility. So what do I collect? This is how I define my collection. I collect medals awarded in North America before 1800, which generally means Indian peace medals and military medals. French and Indian War, Revolutionary medals, Revolutionary War medals, Indian trade medals, things like that. I don't buy a lot of them. I probably haven't added a collection to that in a year, or a specimen to that collection in a year, but it's a neat way to actually collect medals that were in America before 1800. There's not many of them. There's some I'll never get, but I like them. I live in South Carolina, so I collect medals from South Carolina before 1900. Why 1900? What do I have against 20th century medals? Nothing. It's just that there was an exposition in Charleston in 1901, and those medals bore me. So I don't want to buy them. I'm going to buy metals from before 1900 to avoid those metals that would represent something that I would only buy because I felt like I had to. And what fun is that? I collect metals related to Confederate monuments, particularly the metals that kind of went along with and accompanied their actual construction or erection or fundraising for them. I think that's sort of a neat way to interpret modern discussions of Confederate monuments and helps contextualize them into history. I collect metals related to the Mexican-American War. Why? Well, the Mexican-American War is interesting to me. To my mind, it's the most vital historical moment that defined later American history that doesn't get written about or talked about a lot. We wouldn't have Texas. We wouldn't have the California Gold Rush. We wouldn't have the Northwest. The Mexican-American War, I think, is fascinating. Some of you know about my interest in African-American history. I tend to collect medals created either for an African-American audience or struck or cast at the moments of the events, which means that I don't collect medals from 1970 that honor Harriet Tubman. You find me something from 1860 that honors Harriet Tubman, I'm all over it. But things of a strictly commemorative nature, not so much. I like medals that illustrate inflection points, medals that mark some time or moment that history changed. For instance, there was a medal struck to honor the beginning of the relationship between America and the Arab American Oil Company. So much of American history, especially contemporary American history, is related to oil and gasoline and the American relationship in the Middle East. And this medal, given out at a dinner, basically for people at the State Department and oil company execs, that was a real moment that history changed. So I think that's neat. And beyond that, sometimes I buy medals and I couldn't tell you what collection it's going to fit into. I just think they're cool. And you know what? It's my money. It's my safe deposit box. I'll do what I want. And with that, I'm going to open it up for questions. I know there's some things have popped into the chat. So I'm going to open up the chat here if I can. Do I need to stop screen sharing to do that, Len?
Yeah, you can do that, and
Okay.
I can run through the questions. So first question, I'm collecting medals related to first spouses. Any tips for collecting?
Well, you know, something like a first spouse medal that was produced in large numbers by the U.S. Mint. The only question of collecting those is which one will you get next and when will you finish? They're all around. None are particularly rarer than the others. So it's just a matter of collecting them all. So it's sort of like, you know, collecting premiums from a cereal box. You know, at some point you're going to buy the cereal box that has the last one you need for your set. So there's an excitement there about when you'll finish. But you know, collect them in the order you find them, get them in the quality you want to get them, display them or house them in an attractive way that helps you enjoy the series and learn about first spouses. And then once you collect them, decide what's next.
And are there any other earlier 19th or earlier 20th century medals depicting first spouses?
Geez, not really. There are some medals that depict Eleanor Roosevelt from the time of her life. In terms of those that might depict earlier spouse, there's a couple of medals from 1876 that depict Martha Washington that are centennial era things. There might be a few other Martha Washington medals out there. Aside from Martha Washington and Eleanor Roosevelt, I'd be hard pressed to identify them. But that being said, you'll find one someday. You might find one struck by some local historical society with, you know, Lucy Hayes on it. And when you find it, it's going to be $8 and you're going to love it. So that's what collecting these series are kind of all about. And that's where the fun comes in, is that you can figure out what's out there and be the expert. Go be the expert on medals that depict first spouses. You're going to find stuff that I've never seen before. And when you do, it's probably not going to cost you much.
Yeah. All right, next question. What are the best reference books for depictions of medals produced by the U.S. Mint?
Well, ultimately, there's one, and that's the R.W. Julian book on medals of the U.S. Mint. That's the only book that really covers everything from the day the doors open until 1900. Now, if you get into the Julian series, you'll end up finding, say, Indian peace medals, which are covered in a different way by the Pruka book. If you end up pursuing the series of mechanical fairs, some of those are depicted in the Harkness book. So each of those subsections of Julian, there are going to be other books that specialize in them. Or engravers. Chris Newsel wrote a great monograph with the ANS on medals by Moritz First, which covers a bunch of different sorts of U.S. Mint medals.
All right, next question.
Yeah.
This is a softball. Is there a specialty club for metal collectors that you would recommend?
Absolutely. Metal Collectors of America. I'm happy to plug them. The MCA newsletter is one of the all-time great numismatic periodicals of this era or any other, edited by Neil Musante. So definitely check out Metal Collectors of America.
All right. Next, can you recommend reference materials for military medals or Indian peace medals?
Oh, well, Indian peace medals, the primary books, Father Paul Pruka wrote a book called Indian Peace Medals in American History, which is sort of a historical book primarily about the medals and how they were distributed in each American presidential administration. It does cover earlier medals as well. The Jameson book covers medals that illustrate British monarchs that were given to Indians. Of course, the Julian book covers them as products of the U.S. Mint. And beyond that, you're going to get into a lot of articles and monographs and things of that nature. For military medals, it's almost like a whole separate series. It's almost like a whole different field. There's a 3-volume set on military medals of the world. For American medals, things like Purple Hearts and stuff like that. There's a wide variety of references, but it's mostly articles and monographs and things like that.
All right, next question. Been collecting barber medals for 45 years. What are your recommendations for disposing of the collection?
So when you collect a series like barber medals, you end up with medals that fall into a lot of different subcategories that people collect by. I've only ever met one guy that collects barber medals as barber medals, the guy asking this question. So, but what you end up with are the people that collect school medals or agricultural medals or peace medals, which means that from that group of barber medals, as defined as medals by barber, you end up with things that are going to fit into lots of different people's collections, which means you're probably not going to find one person who wants to buy the collection intact, but rather different people who want different chunks of it. And that means that the best way to dispose of a medal collection like that tends to be either auction or selling it to a dealer so that they can find homes for people that collect the other subspecialties that fit into your larger umbrella. And the other possibility for any kind of self-defined collection is an institutional donation. Some museums do a great job integrating medals into their collections. When my African-American medal collection is done, it will probably end up in a museum, just because I know there are museums that look devotedly for objects related to American history or African-American history. And it's nice to see numismatics in museums. Now, that being said, if you collect the Julian series and collect Naval 1 to Naval whatever the last one is, you're probably not going to find a museum that wants to display a Revolutionary War medal as much as a medal devoted to a naval expedition to the Arctic in 1890. So you have to think like a museum curator if that's how you're going to dispose of your collection.
All right, next question. Are you aware of any medals that feature General Santa Anna? And more generally, would you include Mexican medals in your Mexican-American War collection?
I don't know any Santa Anna medals. There may be some Mexican commemorative medals that depict him, but none that I know of. And I would absolutely include Mexican medals. Wars have two sides, and if you collect the war, I would depict all of the combatants for sure.
All right, next, suggestions for storing medals.
I keep my medals for the most part in inert plastic flips and then in boxes. Things like safe flips. This sort of thing like PCGS uses for submissions. They come in a variety of sizes: 2x2, 2.5 by 2.5, and then there are related mylar or inert plastic flips for 3-inch medals, 4-inch medals, what have you. Some people like paper envelopes. That's all fine. You can end up with, lots of different kinds of paper envelopes. Craft envelopes like this work pretty well. I would not use PVC. Metal cabinets have a long tradition, and I have a few. I love them, but the problem with metal cabinets is you can't put them in the bank, and also inevitably friction from sliding around on a tray can be deleterious to preservation. So.
All right. Next question, what is your email address? I have some questions about South Carolina medals.
My email address is jk@jkamericana.com, and maybe Len can put that up in the chat. I'm easy to find. If you know how to spell my name, you know how to find me.
All right, next one. Do you know if there's a successor book to the Betts book in the works? And if so, when will it be published?
I've heard various rumors of such things. I have seen nothing about the project or its progress. The Betts book is a treat, and I love the Betts book. And people will never stop using Betts numbers in the same way that, Dr. Sheldon never used Sheldon numbers. He used Hayes numbers and Clapp numbers and the rest. That being said, the Betts book is a relic. As I mentioned earlier, there's plenty of metals in there that just plain don't exist or you'll never get, or maybe you were struck at a later time period and don't really fit the parameters as defined by the editor of the book. I'd love to write that book. But if I was going to write that book, I'd probably do 2 books. I would probably put out an annotated Betts book, which is to say reprint the Betts book with modern commentary on the metals included, because I think the Betts book will never die, and then write something that was intend to supplant it at some later time.
Yeah, and I'd also recommend Chris McDowell's been researching this series intensely, and he is presenting tomorrow at 2 o'clock Eastern time. So definitely recommend watching that, and that would be a good question for him as well.
For sure.
All right, next, are the medals of the War of 1812 simply covered in other history books and just not collected into a single book, or not covered at all?
I mean, really the only place you're going to see War of 1812 medals covered numismatically are the Julian book. Some of the books like the Lubat book, which covers historical medals through 1876, they're included in there. Chris Newsel covers those that are done by Moritz First in his book on First. The ones that are done by Dupre, like the John Paul Jones medal, are covered in the book by Dupre. But there is no book that self-consciously defines its coverage as 1812 medals. So that would be a great book for someone to write.
All right, next question, are there any downsides or upsides to storing metals in abafill cases?
I've never used abafill cases. I mean, I have some, and the coins that have sat in there for 20 years, haven't gone south on me. It's nice to be able to pull a tray out and actually kind of, look at everything all at once. So that's okay. Obviously there's a potential to be exposed to the elements in a certain way. There's a potential for friction in a certain way, but I think they're probably nice ways to store metals if that's what you're into.
All right, next one's more of a comment. Just said your comment about metals that I might be able to tell a story about resonated with this viewer. And then next question, my challenge is sharing my collection. PCGS has their registry, but only for slabbed items. NGC has theirs, but they list most metals in the non-competitive arena. Do you know what happened in the ANA's registry program? By the way, I completed my set of silver assay commission metals.
Hey, congratulations. That's a great set. Assay metals are awesome. One of my favorites. In terms of sharing, I mean, one thing that I do, I know a lot of y'all probably follow me on Facebook. When I every February for Black History Month, I write up a new African-American historical medal every day and basically write about its history and put it on Facebook. And that's a way both to make people interested in what I'm interested in and get that joy of sharing. But in terms of something like a registry program, it's difficult for metals. I have a love-hate relationship with certification of metals. I think that they have that PCGS and NGC grading them has enabled a lot of metal, or a lot of people who otherwise wouldn't collect metals, to embrace them in a new way. I think registry set collecting, however you define the registry set, is a great way to share them. But both services also have problems with correctly describing metals and things like that, which just comes down to the fact that they don't have many people on their staff that specialize in these things. And understandably, it's not a profit center for them, and they're in business to make money. In terms of how to share things outside of those registry programs, I guess I'd first encourage you to take advantage of those registry programs. I don't know about the ANA's registry program. And beyond that, it's pretty simple to set up a website, some kind of blog through one of the blogging kind of website places, where you put everything in one place and let other people see it, digitally. And of course, that's going to take some work on your part to actually, get that up rather than using someone else's infrastructure. But I don't know of any other sort of free infrastructure to do that, unfortunately.
All right, this is a good question. What auction catalogs would you consider adequate substitutes for reference books?
See behind me? All of those. There's a reason I'm sitting in this office full of books and auction catalogs, because I use every single one of them. They are the best tools for someone who does this for a living like I do. I buy and sell them, I catalog them, I authenticate them. Sometimes I work for museums, And every auction catalog I have, even if it only has 2 or 4 or 10 metals in there, is invaluable. Now, in terms of particular sales, the Newman Numismatic Portal has pretty much the full set of Joe Levine's catalogs, Presidential Coin and Antique. Those are great because Joe really knew what he was doing, and a lot of great metals are described in those pages. The Ford sales done by Stax between 2003 and 2013. If you had to drop me off on a desert island and say you have to keep buying and selling metals and keep cataloging them, but you can only bring one set of books with you, drop me off on the desert island with some water and a set of Ford catalogs, and I could probably manage. Those are very, very important. And sometimes they're important for defining what is available, less important for things like historical information and other stuff. Beyond that, John Adams collected Commission Americana medals. I wrote up his Commission Americana medals and tried to put everything I know about them between two covers. The La Riviere catalogs on Washingtonia and Betts metals. The Baker sale on Washingtoniana is also very important. John Pack wrote that, and it's superb. It's spectacular. There are lots of good auction catalogs that are devoted to Indian peace medals. There are hundreds of them.
All right. Another comment, there's a John Adams reference on Indian peace medals of George III.
Love it. Great book. Got to have it. It's very important, not just for its historic and documentary information, but also for its censuses. So very, very important.
All right. Next one, more detail on the Aberfil cases. Exactly what are they?
Well, you know what? Let me show you. Get a little peek into. So there's little trays like this. So that's the problem with Aberfil cases. You can spill stuff off them. But there are trays like this that depict metals or that hold metals and have little squares, 2x2, 3x3, what have you. And they fit into like a neat little leather briefcase kind of thing. Some people love them. I own one because somebody gave it to me. It's not really my thing. They tend to be relatively expensive. You have to import them from Italy. That being said, they're basically indestructible, and you can buy them used for something of a bargain. So they're worth investigating.
All right. Next question asks, are you a member of the Fairfax Coin Club? I feel like I might know you.
I used to live in Annapolis, Maryland, and attended some coin clubs in the DC area, but it's been many, many years.
Okay. All right, next one, comment. I also recommend storing large and thick metals in 3x3 or 4x4 craft jewelry boxes with common liners.
Yes, yeah, agreed that that's a great way to do it. The only downfall of envelopes is you better describe on the envelope in ink what's in there, because otherwise you're gonna be flipping through a lot of envelopes and that gets frustrating after a while.
All right, next question. What is your sense of the metal collecting arena today and the market for metals, and how do you see it evolving over the next 5, 10, 25 years?
I've never seen as much interest in metals. I've been doing this for a long time. I've been, collecting metals for 30 years at this point. I've been cataloging them for auctions for 20 or more, and I've been collecting them for nearly as long. I've never seen prices for metals and the strength of prices for a lot of this stuff. That being said, there's also plenty of bargains, both in avidly collected series. Indian peace metals are cheaper now than they were 10 years ago because of something of a supply bubble. A little glut of collections have come onto the market, so they're relatively inexpensive comparatively. And how do I see it evolving? Well, I think that most metal collectors at heart are historians. And I think that the more history is in the news, and the more history is a subject of political debate or the subject of, coffee table conversations, I think the more interest in history evolves. And that means that these relics, these objects that tell about our history from the perspective of the time, become more and more desirable, become more and more interesting to people, and more in demand. And as that demand increases, I think that you'll see our market grow. I think that heretofore, most people that end up collecting metals started with coins. All of us have sort of a natural evolutionist collectors. We start with wheat pennies pulled from change and end up with Buffalo nickels or Morgan dollars, and that becomes large cents, and then that becomes metals. I'm overgeneralizing, but that's kind of the way it works for a lot of people. And I think that you're going to end up seeing a lot of people collecting metals who maybe don't have as much of a background in other kinds of American numismatics. But I also think the flip side will happen. The internet has kind of made people able to go from 0 to 60 in a way they weren't before. Before, it took 10 years to evolve from wheat cents to metals. Now you get on a collector's forum or you get on eBay and the whole world is open to you instantly. So you can go from collecting wheat cents to wanting to buy War of 1812 metals in a week. And that just wasn't the way it worked before. So I think that you'll see an increased velocity in collector evolution. And I think inevitably people end up at metals. Not everyone's going to collect metals. Some people are very happy filling a box full of Morgan dollars all, lined up like ducks in a row. But I think if you really love the artistry and you really love the history, metals are something that you're going to pursue eventually. It's just a question of when you get there.
All right, next question. You mentioned a book by Chris Neusel on Moritz First. I wasn't aware of this book. You know what the title is, so I can try and find a copy.
It's included in one of the ANS Coinage of the Americas conference proceedings volumes. I believe it's included in either, I think it's Medal of America Volume 2. Medal of America Volume 1, I think, is somewhat earlier. So hell, Chris might even be on this call and could tell you, but it was published by the ANS as part of a collection of conference proceedings.
Both those books are on Newman Portal, and I'm sure there's plenty of copies on eBay and AP Books as well. So it's called Metal in America. All right, next, is there a hard line of demarcation between things that are metals and things that are tokens? Good question.
There should be. Tokens tend to be trade items. Tokens tend to have a currency value or are good for one shave or good for one loaf of bread or are good for a certain denomination. Metals do not have a currency value, which is why something like a lesser dollar isn't a metal. Now it says it's a metal on the actual piece because the guy was trying not to get busted for counterfeiting. But metals generally do not have a currency or trade relevance, generally.
So the first steam coinage, so-called token, is actually a metal in your point of view.
Yeah, there's a ton of stuff like that. The Rhode Island ship token in the Red Book, it ain't a token, it ain't a coin, it's just a metal. There's a lot of stuff that's kind of been, misnomenclatured over the years.
Yeah. All right, next, what are the buying sources for Indian piece metals analogous to coin shows and auctions?
That depends. Do you want real ones or fake ones? Nothing makes my phone ring more than Indian piece metals. And 99% of the time, 99% of the time when someone says 99% of the time, they're exaggerating. In real talk, 99% of the time when my phone rings about a piece metal, it's fake. 99.9% of the piece metals offered on eBay are fake. And they're not just fake. A lot of them are total fantasies, things that never existed in real history. So when it comes to piece metals, I would stick to dealers like me that know what they're doing. I'm not the only one. There's guys like Tony Terranova and others who deal in authentic Indian piece metals. I would stick to major numismatic auction houses, Stacks, Heritage, places like that. They're not foolproof. Every auction house has sold a fake, but generally I would stick with those. There are other auction houses that occasionally run into Indian piece metals, both in the US and Canada, that are more historical memorabilia or relic places. But the further you get from the sort of central large-scale numismatic houses, the greater your chances of running into a fake. So just tread very, very carefully. And if it seems too good to be true, it is. It's the internet. I spend all day on the internet looking for stuff to buy. You're probably not going to buy an Indian piece metal for $400 in a garage auction in Iowa. Could it happen? I guess. But the odds are I'm going to find it or someone else is going to find it. They're going to pay real money for it. So
yeah, we get a lot of questions at Newman Portal about fake Indian piece metals as well. Yeah. Next comment, it's more of a comment than a question. It says, yeah, I've seen a lot of interest in Civil War and maybe growing in some ways and perhaps becoming more interested along the lines of documents and money and less about Civil War reenactments and other tributes.
Yeah, people want the real stuff. People want to be able to hold these objects and preserve them themselves.
All right, this is a good question. Are there certification services for piece metals? And I guess as a side to that, could you also talk about the accuracy of the grading service attributions?
Well, I've seen piece metals certified by both PCGS and NGC. I don't know that either of them certify them as a matter of course. I think it's more like, when a big collection comes in from an auction house, they'll certify those, but they might not certify yours. I don't want to speak for them. I don't know exactly what their definitions are for what they'll certify and what they won't. I've certainly seen fake piece metals or misdescribed piece metals in certified holders before. I mean, one problem you have with U.S. mint piece metals is, you know, you've got silver ones that were actually awarded to Native Americans, and then copper ones that were struck for collectors. Now, what happens when you take a copper one and you beat it with a sledgehammer and drill a hole with it in it, and then, you know, throw it in the garden for a week or two so it's nice and dirty, and then they certify it as an Indian piece metal? Well, is it still a genuine U.S. mint metal of a Julian listed type? It is. Is it an Indian piece metal? No, it's a copper metal that was struck for collectors that someone drilled a hole in and beat with a hammer and threw in the garden for a week. I see too much stuff like that. And then I don't want to pick on grading services, but then services or dealers or whatever, they can kind of mealy mouth their way around and say, oh, well, it is an 1862 dated Abraham Lincoln piece metal. Well, yeah, sure, but it's not what it purports to be. So just be careful and know that there's a difference between an authentic U.S. mint struck metal and a metal that was actually distributed to Native Americans or what have you.
All right, next question. Are there any collectibles which are considered both metals and coins, or is there a strict dividing line between the two?
There are certainly things that kind of straddle that fence, aren't there? The Carolina elephant tokens. So they're called tokens. I just used the term. They're listed in the Red Book as coins. They are the size of a copper halfpenny, and given how worn most of them are, they probably circulated as such, but they're also listed in the Betts Book of Early American Metals. What are they? I haven't the faintest idea, because in order to tell you what they are, I have to know for what purpose they were produced, and I don't, neither does anybody else. So is a Carolina elephant token a token? Is it a copper halfpenny of a distinctive design? Is it a metal commemorating Carolina? I don't know. And a lot of this stuff comes down to the purpose for which these things were produced, and some of these things we just don't know. I'm sure I could come up with other examples beyond the elephant tokens if I had to.
I think I've even seen a theory that the St. Patrick pieces were actually metals.
I would think that's unlikely, just because there are hundreds of different dies, which to my mind probably suggests a large enough production run to intimate some kind of currency use. But again, there's no documentary evidence, so anything I could say would be speculative.
Yeah. All right. Just a comment. Love your thoughts on finding fakes. Flea market sell fakes, not real ones. You won't find rare stuff on a Sunday morning sale.
It used to happen more in the days before eBay and the internet.
Yeah.
You know, now if somebody finds a piece metal, it's easy to get my phone number, my email address online and say, hey, is this real or fake? You know, when I started collecting this stuff in the 80s or 90s, it happens sometimes. You might find something at the local auction house or at a firehouse yard sale. Today, it's pretty unusual.
And if people see one story on CNN, they think it's commonplace.
Also true.
when the reason that it's on CNN to begin with is that it's not commonplace.
Yep. News is because it's news, not because it's common. So.
Oh, well, here's a good one. Are continental dollars actually European metals? If so, why are there so many varieties?
Yes, they are, and I will absolutely defend that to my dying day. There's plenty of good evidence that they are European metals, and basically no good evidence that they're not. And in terms of why there's so many varieties, that I couldn't tell you, except that it suggests a large production run, doesn't it? So,
and why are so many of them edge marked as opposed to other metals?
That's also an interesting question. If they were trying to imitate a dollar, a Spanish mill dollar, a pillar dollar of the time had that kind of edge marking. Edge marked metals are distinctive. They're unusual, but they're certainly not unique. That's not the only thing like that. But yes, there's, if you're going to do the preponderance of the evidence kind of thing and say what has more evidence that they're European metals or not, vastly more evidence. In fact, I would say basically 100% more evidence that they're European metals and not American made.
Yeah. And of course, Eric Goldstein and David McCarthy wrote a pair of great articles on that.
They did. Yep.
All right. Last question. How are Betts metals distributed? Was it similar to the U.S. mint metals? Was the sale of base metal metals used as means of funding the production and presentation of silver and gold metals? Or were they all presentation pieces?
There are 623 different Betts metals, and I could give you 623 different answers, more or less. Some were made consciously to be collected, made for the European or American cabinets of the day. Some were made as essentially souvenirs. I'll give you this hint. If a metal typically comes in high grade, from whatever era. It was made to be collected by people who have cabinets or other ways to secure them and display them. If a medal tends to come beat up, it was made for a more general audience. And in terms of production and distribution, there's lots of different answers for that.
I'm going to squeeze in one more here. What sources are there for information about the 20th century U.S. Mint medals?
RG 104, Records Group 104 at the National Archives. All the documents are there. You're an American. You have a right to see them. Go find them. That's pretty much the answer.
The other thing I would say there is the Congressional Record
Yep.
has an extraordinary amount of information about 20th century medals. You do have to get into academic databases to see it, but the information is out there.
That's right.
If there's a particular piece you're researching, feel free to send me a mail at Newman Portal about it, and I can probably find some things for you.
Good
All right,
deal.
well, thanks so
Really good
much, Don. This was great.
So that's all I got. I appreciate the interest. I appreciate the good questions. And if anyone has any more questions, you know where to find me. jk@jkamericana.com is my email address. Be patient. I'm a pretty busy guy, but I'll try to email or try to answer every email I get.
All right, excellent. Thanks everyone for attending, and thank you, John.
All right. Thank you all. Appreciate it.
Be in touch.